In the world of Eorzea, our character is known as the Warrior of Light. A title like that has strong implications, but just because you're fighting for good doesn't mean you can't embrace the darkness. Final Fantasy XIV's Dark Knight has had a hard time finding a place alongside the other tanks in the game since its release, but the Shadowbringers expansion has reworked its kit, altering its playstyle, bolstering its defenses, and transforming it into a job that I always want to fight as or alongside. Today we're going to overview the Dark Knight and see how Eorzea's edgiest tank gets the job done. Let's get started. Just like the other tanks, the Dark Knight uses a simple 1-2-3 combo as the foundation for its combat. This combo is used to generate both of the Dark Knight's resources, MP and Black Blood. MP is generated by the second hit in the combo, and Blood is generated by the final hit. MP is used for both offensive and defensive abilities, which we'll talk about soon, and Blood is a simpler resource that's only used for the weapon skills Blood Spiller, a high damage single target attack, and Quietus, a moderate damage area attack. At level 80, the Blood Gauge can also be used to summon a living shadow that fights by your side for 24 seconds. This is a versatile damage ability that uses high damage single target attacks and area attacks for the duration of its summon. The living shadow is fully autonomous and will perform actions without additional inputs. Also, like the Machinist's Automaton Queen, the living shadow's summoning time is part of its duration, so the total combat time is 18 seconds with 6 seconds reserved for a dramatic entrance. Going back to the MP resource, this is the Dark Knight's most important asset, and there are a lot of tools at your disposal to manage it and spend it. You regenerate 200 MP every 3 seconds while in combat, and the second hit of your 1-2-3 combo restores 600 MP. For group fights, the second hit of your AoE combo Stalwart Soul restores 600 MP. The ability Blood Weapon learned at level 35 increases the blood gauge by 10 and restores 600 MP whenever you land a weapon skill. Blood Weapon lasts for 10 seconds and has a 60-second cooldown. When executed correctly, you can land 5 weapon skills during Blood Weapon for a total of 3,000 mana restored. In order to consistently land all 5 weapon skills during Blood Weapon's duration, you don't want to activate it too early into the cooldown of the global cooldown. Next, Delirium learned at level 68 allows you to use Blood Spiller and Quietus without spending your blood gauge for 10 seconds, and these weapon skills restore MP. While Delirium is active, Blood Spiller restores 200 MP, and Quietus restores 500 MP. The final MP restoration ability is Carve and Spit. This is a moderate damage ability that restores 600 MP on a 60-second cooldown. Now that we know all the ways to restore MP, let's talk about how to spend it. MP is used to activate the defensive ability, the Blackest Night. For 3000 MP, you create a barrier around yourself or a party member that absorbs damage equal to 25% of the target's maximum HP. The barrier lasts for 7 seconds and has a cooldown of 15 seconds. Additionally, if the barrier is broken, you gain the effect of Dark Arts on your job gauge, and this is where things start to get interesting. The Dark Knight has 2 offensive off-global cooldown abilities that cost 3000 MP, Edge of Shadow and Flood of Shadow. These abilities deal single target and area damage respectively and grant the buff Dark Side for 30 seconds, which increases your damage dealt by 10% for the duration. Dark Side can be extended to a maximum of 60 seconds. While you have Dark Arts, these abilities cost 0 MP, and with that, the gameplay loop for the Dark Knight has become clear. Instead of choosing between going all in with aggression or hunkering down for defense, you're meant to marry the 2 styles. With that in mind, you can dump all of your MP into Edge or Flood of Shadow, but in general, you'll want to properly manage your MP resource. This means using the Blackest Night in situations where you're certain the shield will break to grant you Dark Arts, which can be consumed with Edge or Flood of Shadow. A natural follow-up question is, how do you know if enemies are going to damage you enough to break the Blackest Night? You have to experiment, however there are situations that will almost always guarantee a break. Large dungeon pulls output massive damage, so using the Blackest Night during them will always grant you Dark Arts. Also, enemy tank busters will break your shield with ease, especially if you aren't complementing it with other cooldowns. Using the Blackest Night every 15 seconds will slowly deplete your MP, but as soon as you factor in your 1-2-3 combo and MP restoring abilities in addition to your ambient MP recovery, you'll notice that there's room for you to play with how you spend your resources. In general, I don't like my MP to go too far below 3000 or too high above 9000. Staying within that space will ensure that I always have enough MP for damage from my shadow attacks or defense from the Blackest Night. The primary function of the Blackest Night is to mitigate damage from tank busters, and when paired with any of the defensive cooldowns in the Dark Knight's robust kit, you're very likely to reduce your damage taken to 0. That might sound bad since taking 0 damage means your barrier wasn't broken and you won't get dark arts, but most bosses follow up tank busters with an auto attack, and that is very likely to remove the remaining health on the barrier. With that in mind, defending yourself with the Dark Knight requires a bit more attention to detail than is required on the other tanks. Your unique mitigation cooldown is called Dark Mind. Learned at level 45, this ability reduces magic damage taken by 20% for 10 seconds on a 60-second cooldown. You also have an AoE version called Dark Missionary, which reduces magic damage taken by you and nearby party members by 10% for 15 seconds on a 90-second cooldown. These abilities are situational and won't have much use in dungeon pulls, as most dungeon enemies deal physical damage. Dark Mind and Missionary also don't have value in every boss fight, but when you do go up against an enemy that uses magic damage attacks, you'll feel like a god. However, this doesn't mean you'll feel weak when fighting enemies that use primarily physical attacks. The Blackest Knight's cooldown is shorter than the other tank's comparable cooldowns, and it can be used every 15 seconds despite its resource cost. Ideally though, you'll time the Blackest Night so that it breaks, granting dark arts instead of using it whenever it's ready. Additionally, Dark Knight has access to the generic cooldowns that all tanks have. Rampart reduces damage taken by 20% for 20 seconds on a 90-second cooldown, and Shadow Wall reduces damage taken by 30% for 10 seconds with a 120-second cooldown. So, if you're using the actions that are available to you, you'll be just as defensively strong as a warrior, paladin, or gunbreaker. This doesn't mean there are no weaknesses in the Dark Knight's kit. Unfortunately, it does not have strong health sustain. The third hit in your 1-2-3 combo restores a small amount of health, and the area attack Abyssal Drain deals low damage and has a cure potency of 200. Against multiple targets, Abyssal Drain is nice, but its long cooldown makes it feel a bit insignificant. One last thing to note is that the Blackest Night makes the Dark Knight incredibly valuable as an off-tank or a main tank. While in the off-tank position, stacking the Blackest Night with the main tank's defensive cooldowns will cause them to take 0 damage from attacks that would otherwise leave them battered and bruised. Before we wrap things up, we have to talk about the Dark Knight's invulnerability skill, Living Dead. There's a strong case to be made that Living Dead is the worst invulnerability skill in the game. On activation, you gain a buff called Living Dead for 10 seconds. If your HP is reduced to 0 during that time, you'll gain a new buff called Walking Dead, which lasts for 10 seconds. If you're not healed to maximum HP before Walking Dead expires, you'll die. That's the part that makes Living Dead feel lackluster in comparison to the other invulnerability skills. If you're taking damage while Walking Dead is active, it'll be very difficult for your healer to bring you back to maximum. With that in mind, if you have the Blackest Night and other cooldowns ready, you can reduce your damage taken for the 10-second window of Walking Dead, during which time your healer should be able to save you. Overall, the Dark Knight is a bit complex because of the resource management you have to do. Spending too much on offense will leave you defensively weak, and focusing only on defense will waste potential damage from Edge and Flood of Shadow. But once you come to terms with that, the basic rotation is very simple. Another thing that makes the Dark Knight more challenging than the other tanks are its specialized cooldowns, Dark Mind and Dark Missionary. Knowledge of boss damage and attack patterns will see your effectiveness go up significantly. This is true for other tanks, but especially true for proper execution of the Blackest Night and usage of your magic damage reducing abilities. But with that said, the challenge feels worthwhile, because when your enemy winds up their most powerful attack and you take 0 damage, there's no better feeling. And there we go, that's going to do it for the overview of the Dark Knight. I do realize that I didn't mention the Salted Earth ability, and I was very quick to mention Abyssal Drain, and that's because those are 2 abilities in the Dark Knight's kits that could use some decent buffs. Their cooldowns are a little bit too long for the effects that they provide. Also, I don't think the Dark Knight is in a perfect state. It feels really great to play, but there are little things that could be done to make it feel absolutely perfect. I'm not going to get too much into my own ideas, but in the comment section, people have been throwing out different suggestions for what they think could be done to the Dark Knight's existing kit to make it feel a little bit better, and I've agreed with a lot of them, disagreed with some, but it's been a really fun discussion. So if you have any thoughts on the Dark Knight, be sure to drop them below. With that said, if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to support the channel more than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and commenting, you can head over to patreon.com/iBluairJgR to become a patron. As always, the name of the game is Final Fantasy XIV, the name of the channel is iBluairJgR. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.